Every year before the NFL draft, it's the same debate, film versus analytics. And you have some people that are hardcore film watchers, and that's all that matters to them. And you've got other people that are hardcore numbers people, and that's all that matters to them. But you know, here at the Fantasy Headliners, we do a little bit of both, and I've been watching film for months now, so let's dive into some numbers. And to start with, it's the wide receivers. Let's use some of those deep diving stats to see who are the most explosive wide receivers from college football that will be in the draft this year. Today's video is all about using those deep diving statistics to try and figure out what wide receivers in this year's NFL draft may be some of the biggest playmakers in the NFL next year. And if you're used to watching our videos, some of these statistics will probably look really familiar from some of the videos that we do each offseason for fantasy football. And if you want to read my take on all of these rookies that I've been watching film on, you can find those in our Fantasy Headliners draft guide. And I'm going to give one away for free in this video. And our draft guide this year is bigger than ever. We've opened it up 3 months early and stocked it full of rookie profiles, injury profiles, dynasty rankings, rookie rankings, and a lot more content as well. And all of that good redraft content that you've become used to in our draft guide will be dropping throughout the rest of the summer. And don't forget, our draft guide updates periodically all the way up to the start of the season. So all you need to do at the end of this video is make sure you like it, make sure you're subscribed, and then comment down below which one of these wide receivers you want to see your favorite team walk away with the most. And I'll pick one person from the comments if this video gets 500 likes to go ahead and give a free draft guide to. Alright, so a quick explanation. What I've done here is taken the names of the top 20 draft eligible wide receivers from college football this year. And I have imported the numbers in several key statistical areas that I really like to look at when I try to figure out what wide receivers will be the most explosive at the next level. And I went through and I ranked all of these guys in order in each separate category. And then at the end, put together an overall average of each finishing position to find out who finished the highest across the board. And the first statistic I want to take a look at is receptions. And a name that may not be familiar to you is Malik Washington out of Virginia, who led all draft eligible wide receivers last season with 111 receptions. And if Malik Washington's name isn't very familiar, don't you worry. You're going to hear a lot more of it by the end of this video. And overall, for the receptions column, a lot of the names at the top of the board are guys that we really don't associate with being some of the better wide receivers in this draft class, which will make a little bit more sense here in a minute. But you see names like Isaiah Williams, Jacob Cowing, and Malachi Corley. And if you toss in Xavier Leggett and Luke McCaffrey, all the guys that I just mentioned finished last season with more receptions than the generational talent himself, Marvin Harrison Jr. But that's why we look at several statistics across the board and we don't just focus on one area. So let's go ahead and move on to receiving yards. What about two Maliks, one category? Because Malik Neighbors and Malik Washington were both at the top of wide receivers in receiving yards last year. I told you Malik Washington was going to come up again. But now this is where you start to see some of these bigger names come up to the top of the board. Troy Franklin, Rome Odunze, Marvin Harrison Jr., Brian Thomas, all these guys who maybe weren't as high in the receptions category as we would have thought are a lot higher in receiving yards than what some of those other names were. One of the biggest differences from receptions to receiving yards was Jacob Cowing from Arizona, who finished 3rd in receptions, but finished 14th in receiving yards. While flipping that the other way, Brian Thomas went from being 13th in receptions to 7th in receiving yards. I do have some concerns over 3 guys that we see at the bottom of the list. 3 guys that are actually looked at as being potential first-round picks. And that's Adonai Mitchell, Keon Coleman, and Ladd McConkey, who actually finished pretty low in both of these categories. All right, moving on to touchdown receptions, who are some guys that maybe were scoring quite a bit, even if they weren't putting up a ton of volume? And it's crazy to see the 2 top players in this year's NFL draft in touchdowns last year were both from LSU. And there's one question I'm hearing come up quite a bit lately, and that's about Jaden Daniels. Did he help make these fabulous seasons for Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas? Or was it the other way around? Malik Neighbors and Marvin Harrison Jr., both considered to be potential top 5 picks, were tied for second this past year with 14 touchdowns, and also tied with them was the speedster Troy Franklin out of Oregon. And while his NFL upside may not be like some of these other guys, if he can land in the right system and a head coach can utilize him properly, the speedster could see some big plays at the NFL level still. Luke McCaffrey, 6 with 12 touchdowns last season, and for a name not talked about a whole lot, for the first 3 categories we've talked about in this video, he's been mentioned inside the top 10 each time. Now we've got some interesting names tied with 11 touchdowns each. Malachi Corley, his name is coming up once again. And then Jacob Cowing from Arizona, who wasn't putting up a ton of yards, but clearly was scoring touchdowns. And Roman Wilson, who kind of fell into the same category as Cowing. Wasn't getting a lot of receptions, wasn't getting a lot of receiving yards, but had a nose for the end zone. All right, let's talk about some big playability here, because yards after the catch are big at the NFL level. If you run the right routes and you beat your defenders, the hope is that you're going to make a tackler miss or be open enough that you're going to pick up a ton of yards after the catch. And Malik Washington finds himself at the top once again. This is going to be a kid that we are going to need to keep our eye on. And I've looked at him a little bit, but haven't dove into him as much as I would have liked to prior to this video, and seeing these numbers opened up my eyes to let me know, hey, we need to be taking a deeper look at him. So we're going to get a player profile in the draft guide for him as soon as possible. Malachi Corley, he is second in this category. His name comes up inside the top 10 yet again. Now the issue with Malachi Corley is going to be the fact that he played in a pass-heavy offense while playing against talent that would be considered probably subpar compared to some of the other guys these players went up against. Now, yards after the catch are not everything, and if you've got guys making some really nice contested catches, which we'll talk about here in a second, they're not going to pick up a lot of yards after the catch as it is. But there's a few names that still are concerning for me being this low. Guys like Keon Coleman, Ladd McConkey, and Adonai Mitchell once again find themselves towards the bottom of another category. And all 3 of those guys are considered to be big play type of receivers that just aren't making nearly enough yards up after the catch as some of their counterparts in this draft. Now, what about yards per route run? And we're going to throw an efficiency category in here. And essentially what this tells us is for every route that these players ran, how many yards did they average for those routes? So essentially when you see a guy like Ladd McConkey up here at number 2 overall in this category, one thing that this tells me is, hey, while he didn't pick up a whole lot of volume statistics, he also didn't run a whole lot of routes and was a guy that was probably on the sideline more times than not. And because of that, his yards per route run were a lot higher than some of these other guys. So then that begs the question about a guy like Ladd McConkey. Numbers aren't really there. When you watch the tape is not bad. You definitely see some good things on the tape. And he performed really well at the combine. His athletic testing was exceptional. So what are you buying into here? Do the small sample sizes that we see from Ladd McConkey of his athleticism translate so well to the NFL level that he becomes an absolute playmaker that should be talked about in the first round? Or should we look at the fact that he just didn't put up great numbers overall? And while the athleticism is there, he may not be the guy that we could rely on a consistent basis. One guy whose name has come up quite a bit, but I haven't really dove into so far, Xavier Legette out of South Carolina. Xavier Legette to me is really kind of like diet DK Metcalf. He doesn't have some of the same size that DK Metcalf has, but he brings a lot of the same question marks that DK Metcalf did when he came out of Ole Miss a few years ago. Some numbers that weren't all that great. At the combine, some testing numbers that you looked at and you said, what's he going to be able to do? But overall could end up being a guy that just wins down the field. And sometimes that's all you need to do to be a good wide receiver. Could Xavier Legette end up being another 3rd round steal just like DK Metcalf was? And then Roman Wilson finished 8th in this category. Once again, played in an offense that ran the football an awful lot. And when they did throw the football, they did a good job of spreading it around. Cornelius Johnson, who is also in this draft class, Colston Loveland, other guys that they threw the ball to, Donovan Edwards out of the backfield. And because of that being such a run-heavy offense, you didn't see the gaudy numbers like some of these other guys. But then you see a good efficiency number here from him and the fact that he scored 11 touchdowns. And you got to think that with the right team at the NFL level, he could be due for some serious volume. And I don't know, catching passes out of the slot from Justin Herbert sounds pretty darn good to me. All right, let's take a look at contested catches, because I love to see that from wide receivers moving from the college level to the NFL level, because I love to see that you can fight for the ball and fight for it consistently. And Rome Odunze out of Washington probably doesn't shock anybody. In my player profiles and my scouting reports about Rome Odunze, I've talked about the fact that he's going to be a big playmaker down the field because of how good he is at the point of the catch. But how about Luke McCaffrey being tied with him? Luke McCaffrey was a quarterback just a couple of years ago, but it seems like he's transitioned to wide receiver very well. He's still going to be a bit of a project, but with the right team, he could end up working out to be a solid contributor at the NFL level. In this draft class, Jalen Polk isn't really seen as like a top-end wide receiver, but I definitely could see him being a guy that works out of the slot and does it consistently well. He did very well in contested catches last year. He's got super strong hands and he runs pretty decent routes. Now, he's probably not going to play very well against some of the top corners in the league, but if you put him up against some nickel cornerbacks, he absolutely could beat those. All right, missed tackles forced for the wide receiver position aren't nearly as a valuable stat as some of these other guys, but we're talking about explosiveness here. And part of that is making guys miss and then picking up extra yards after the catch. And once again, at the top, we've got the Maliks. Neighbors and Washington both lead in this category with some pretty high numbers at 35 and 30. Because then the next closest person is at 24, Isaiah Williams out of Illinois. But then what's even crazier than that is a guy like Troy Franklin, who is seen as being that type of a player at the next level. Get the ball in his hands, he's gonna make guys miss, and he's gonna beat them with his speed. He's even further down the list with only 13 missed tackles forced. That right there puts it into perspective on how good Malik Neighbors could end up being at the next level, and why Malik Washington is going to be a name that I am much higher on now that I've actually looked at some of these stats. And it's super interesting to note that Marvin Harrison Jr. is towards the bottom of this category. And while Marvin Harrison Jr. continues to be my wide receiver one in this class, it's why I continue to say Malik Neighbors, I think, is a lot closer than what people give him credit for. There are some people out there that think Neighbors is actually a better prospect than what Marvin Harrison Jr. is. Now, I'm not necessarily going to go that far, but I will repeat something I have said a lot on this channel over the last couple of months. While Marvin Harrison Jr. may be super safe and is going to do a lot of really good things at the next level, we're taking a look at Malik Neighbors as being the next Jamar Chase, Odell Beckham Jr., with hopefully a longer lifespan than OBJ, and being able to put up gaudy numbers just like both of these guys have. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the average score for all 20 wide receivers. And keep in mind, the lower the score, the more explosive they are. And it's no surprise to anybody, including myself, Malik Neighbors is at number 1, and it wasn't close. But then Malik Washington out of Virginia at number 2. And maybe it's playing in the ACC and not facing the tough type of competition that you would have liked to see on a weekly basis defensive-wise from like the Big Ten or the SEC, or definitely not the Big 12. But when you take a look at the numbers that he put up last year, he looked really, really, really good in these categories. I am keeping my eye on Malik Washington. This is a potential day 2 pick that absolutely could end up being a steal for somebody in the 3rd round. And it wouldn't shock me either if he fell into maybe like the 4th round on day 3 and then ended up having the type of career that we've seen a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown have so far. Then Troy Franklin, Rome Odunze, and Marvin Harrison Jr. will round out the top 5. And there's no shock that Odunze and Marvin Harrison Jr. fall in here. And even though Troy Franklin isn't the type of NFL prospect that I think a lot of people would like him to be, there's no doubting he put together some crazy numbers at Oregon, and in the right offense could end up doing some things similar to what we've seen like a Curtis Samuel do at times. All right, rounding out the top 10 are a few guys that I'm not super surprised about. well. Malachi Corley came up quite a bit, Xavier Leggett came up quite a bit, and so did Luke McCaffrey. And while Isaiah Williams wasn't talked about a whole lot in this video, there's been some decent things we've seen in the numbers, and maybe his tape deserves a second look as well. But I have to say, I'm super disappointed in the numbers that I saw from Brian Thomas. I really like him, and he has a lot of good things that show up on tape. And really, he's just outside that top tier of wide receivers in this class. So in the first probably 10 picks, you're going to see Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze go off the board. Those are my top 3. Brian Thomas Jr. is right after all of those guys for me. But these numbers are really not promising. And these numbers have put a little bit of doubt into my head about a similar situation we saw from LSU wide receivers a few years back. Jamar Chase was seen as the best guy coming out of LSU. But Terrace Marshall Jr. was somebody that a lot of people, including myself, thought could excel at the next level. And he hasn't done anything since he's entered the league and gone to Carolina. So who is Brian Thomas? Is he a true threat at the wide receiver position based on what we've seen on tape? Well, you know what? Terrace Marshall Jr. looked really good a few years ago when a Heisman winning quarterback, Joe Burrow, was also throwing him the football. So maybe Jaden Daniels just made Brian Thomas look a lot better than what he is. 2 of the better big play receivers in this draft class, Xavier Worthy and Keon Coleman, are going to fit here inside the top 15. This third group here, you take a look at them and they hit or miss in a few different categories, but overall just didn't have a super solid stretch of numbers. Both Worthy and Coleman have shown us some things on tape that lead us to believe their big play ability is absolutely going to be utilized at the NFL level. And running the fastest 40 time at the combine ever by Xavier Worthy is going to help that. But this is part of my worries with Xavier Worthy, is that he's going to end up being a guy that is less like Deshaun Jackson and more like Henry Ruggs. And the fact that when Henry Ruggs was drafted, he was overdrafted because of his speed and because of where he played. He didn't have super great numbers. He wasn't really the number 1 on his team. And even though he showed some glimpses, there was a team that took a stab at him just because they loved the speed. That same thing could happen to Xavier Worthy. He's undersized, he's not very heavy, and he's not the strongest wide receiver that you're going to find in this class. He's going to have to beat people with his speed. And at the NFL level, if he doesn't do that consistently, he's not going to see the ball consistently either. And now in the bottom 5, and 2 of my Michigan guys are down here with Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson, which isn't shocking given the fact that just overall lack of numbers wouldn't allow them to go any higher. So those are guys, when you take a look at the numbers, they don't stand out on paper. So you really have to dive into the film to find out what you have with them. But they're also not being looked at as top-end draft picks like Ladd McConkey or Adonai Mitchell, who also find themselves down here in the bottom 5. And for a couple of guys that are supposed to have big playability at the next level, I don't love the fact that their numbers don't look better than what they do here. But Headliner Nation, you need to let me know down in the comments your thoughts on some of the numbers that you see here. Do you have a wide receiver that's going up your rankings now? Do you have a wide receiver that's falling down your rankings because of what you've seen? And don't forget, if this video gets 500 likes, we're going to pick somebody in the comment section to give a draft guide to. So make sure you like the video, make sure you subscribe if you're new here, and turn on the bell notification so anytime we go live or drop new content, you'll know about it right away. And YouTube is probably recommending one of our last videos to you right now. If you missed that for some reason, you need to check it out. But for now, Headliner Nation, peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we run